Good morning, everybody. My name is Jacob Isleib. I'm the state soil scientist for Connecticut and Rhode Island with USDA NRCS.
And I'm Morgan McKee, and I am the resource soil scientist for Connecticut USDA NRCS.
Today we're going to be showing you a rainfall simulator, and just briefly what this is and what we're going to do is we're going to simulate a really intense rainfall event over some different soil trays that we've gathered from sites that are under different management or land use.
So our first management type over here is a forest management, so what we could consider a natural management here in Connecticut. So you can see there would be a variety of different species present. There would be cover year-round in form of leaf litter. There would be living roots throughout the year from the different trees and undergrowth species that are present. So basically an undisturbed natural Connecticut soil. What we have next is turf grass, so essentially what you would see in your lawn. These are disturbed pretty frequently from people just living their lives, mowing grass, just being out in the lawn. You're typically only going to have a couple of species. These tend to be monocultures, so you'd have maybe one or two species present in your lawn, but it wouldn't be super diverse. Next, we're going to be looking at hayland. So hayland is usually disturbed. There's 3 times per haying, usually 3 cuts of hay taken per year, and then you'll have maybe 1 passover for fertilization, so not a lot of disturbance. We have at least 4 species in this particular one, so a variety of species. There's cover over the soil throughout the year, and those roots are living most of the year as well. Next, we have our no-till operation here. So there is going to be some disturbance when you're planting annually tilled crops or annually no-tilled crops. You would still have to do some soil disturbance to get them in the ground and to collect them. But you are going to have some type of soil cover throughout the year, and then oftentimes there will be a cover crop as well. This last tray here is conventional tillage. This specifically is silage corn. There's going to be a lot of passes throughout the year for fertilization, planting, spraying, harvest, all of that stuff. So a lot of disturbance. There's not a lot of ground cover here. You see there are some plants. This is weed growth and not a cover crop. So there's not a cover crop throughout the winter. It's not covered over the winter. And there's, not a lot of biodiversity. There's just going to be the corn and then whatever weeds happen to grow at the end of the year.
So why might we expect different performance out of these trays collected from different land uses? So there's a lot of different properties that we can observe in soils, everything from soil color, soil texture, structure, consistence. Some of these are more or less static or unchangeable in soils, like texture, but other properties are considered more dynamic, and they may change to a great extent under different management or land uses. And so the difference in response to this heavy rainfall event that we're about to simulate is going to be related to these dynamic soil properties, and in particular soil structure, the amount of soil organic matter accumulation, and those are really kind of the 2 big ones there that we're going to show today. So we'll talk a little bit more about that after we're done with the simulation. All right, so we're about ready to begin our simulation. I just wanted to give you a few more details about what we have set up here. So we're going to give it a really intense rainfall event, about 1 inch of rain in just a few minutes. But we have been seeing really, really intense rainstorms with some of the extreme weather that we're getting. So it is something that we see on the farm. And you'll note that these trays are set at an incline. This incline is simulating about a 25% slope. So a steep site, but again, we do see soils being managed for hay or sometimes even cropland on very, very steep slopes. So again, something that we see on the farm.
Now that it's running, we may start to see some erosion, and there are 3 different principles of erosion. The first is detachment, so this is when the soil actually detaches from where it is. We might see some splatter on the back of the whiteboard, which would be an indicator of this detachment. Then is transportation, so that's when the soil actually starts to move and we start to see visually some runoff. The final is deposition, and that's when the soil gets to its new place, and then deposits in a new area. When this happens very locally, we might see some what's called soil crusting. So you'll actually see what looks to be like cracks in the soil because the soil has detached and moved to a different place very locally where it is. What you might have noticed in some of the close-ups was actually a dime on the soil surface. We're not sure what we might see today, but that dime is there basically to protect that small, tiny little piece of soil from getting any of this rain. And so that's preventing that first step of detachment. So we might then be able to see a difference in what's happening to the soil underneath that dime versus the soil around it. So as it's running, you can kind of look in the front and see the difference in kind of some of the water that is coming off of the trays. You'll see some of the water is very, very dirty, which indicates that maybe there's a lot of soil that has moved with the water. And some of it's a little cleaner, which means maybe, the water hasn't moved as much soil. You also notice differences in the amount of water in each of the buckets, which we'll talk a little bit more about what that means at the end of the example.
All right, so our simulation is finished. It's just about 5 minutes later, so we gave it a really hard inch of rain in not a lot of time. But let's look at what we have in the first row of jugs here. So you can see all the way here on your right, we have the conventionally tilled sample and the jug collecting runoff from this sample. There's a lot of amount of water in that. And then, like Morgan had mentioned, you can see all the cloudiness in that. There was a lot of dispersed soil that got washed off-site in that sample. Compare that to what we have next to it, also an agriculturally managed soil, but we have reduced or minimum no tillage being used here. You can see there's a lot of surface residues on, and look at the response that we got compared with runoff. So there's essentially no runoff off-site despite all the rainfall that we gave it. So a huge change in response between these two cropland soils. Moving on over here to our hay sample, you can see we also have very little runoff in that sample, and then the color of any runoff in there, it's very clear. So very little erosion in this sample. Same with moving over to this area, maybe a little bit more runoff from this turf sample, but a very similar response to what we got on the hay with the permanent cover. We have a lot of this in Connecticut with all of our residential areas, and so you know there's quite a bit of land in Connecticut that's under this turf or passive lawn type management. And then finally on the right is our forest sample, and you can see that we essentially had no runoff off that. So the forest is kind of considered like our control for this experiment or simulation, but the most minimal amount of disturbance, and you can see the difference with the amount of runoff that came off it. So what we have here next is actually the big reveal. Let's move these runoff jugs to the side, and we can take off this panel. And behind we have another row of jugs, and the way that these trays are set up, the water that infiltrates into the sample and is able to move through the tray, through the soil in the tray, can be captured in these jugs behind. So we're going to pull these out so that you can see the difference in the amount of infiltration. Okay, so we have our infiltration jugs set up in front of the trays that they came from. And again, what we want to look at is the amount of water that was able to infiltrate the tray, and then also the clarity of the water, any difference in appearance that we can see. So with our conventionally tilled sample all the way here on your right, you can see that we generally have less water infiltrated, especially compared with the agricultural sample next to it under no-till management, and the water's pretty cloudy with what came through. So Morgan had mentioned surface crusting. With erosion, you get that detachment of particles, and the first thing that happens with that, with creating, say, like a surface crust, is that those detached particles would start to move into voids between soil structural aggregates and start to fill those in. And so we're seeing some of that in the water that infiltrated there. There's detached soil particles in there. Looking on to the next tray, our no-till sample, we have a lot more water was able to infiltrate. So we had less runoff in that sample, and we were able to capture a lot more of the water from that intense rainfall event. The clarity of the water is still a little cloudy, so the water that infiltrated did have some dispersed soil in it. And again, these two kind of represent the most amount of disturbance on the site being under a cropping system or that type of agricultural management. But definitely minimized amount of runoff, more infiltration in the no-till. Got a lot better performance out of that. Moving on next into our more permanent covers here, you can see in this Halen sample, much clearer water than we had in the crop systems, and a nice large amount of water infiltrated, especially when we compare that to our other permanently covered turf site. Similar water clarity, but a lot less water was able to infiltrate through the tray, which is interesting. We'll talk a little bit later about soil properties specifically. One that could be responsible for this is increased compaction on this, where we have a lot of traffic from, say, being mowed, like in a regular lawn type turf situation. So we got more runoff, less water infiltrated into this. And our most dramatic infiltration sample here, you can see the forest was able to essentially capture all the water that we gave that sample. That one had essentially no runoff in the first row of jugs, and then we just about filled this one. So forests have a really incredible capacity to capture and store water on site, even under really, really extreme rainfall events.
So this simulation today really shows the importance of the core soil health practices or principles from NRCS. So those are, I'm sure you've heard them, so we're minimizing disturbance, we're maximizing cover, maximizing biodiversity, and maximizing live roots. So how did each of those principles translate into this? So first, when we have cover, that helps to prevent that first part of erosion, which is the detachment. So coming back to the dime that we put on the top, you'll see the dime, which was originally flush with the top of the soil, now is almost on top of a little bit of pedestal, because the soil that was hit by the water all around that dime was detached and moved away. So that importance of that cover is to keep that first attachment from happening. Then we run into these instances that were more, there was less disturbance, we had better infiltration. So there's not as much compaction of the soil where it's pressed down, where water can't get through it. So that minimizing that disturbance helps to keep the soil pores more open where water can go through them. Then with maximizing the live roots, again, that helps to keep those pores open so that water can move through the soil and is able to get it down into the soil so that eventually the roots can kind of bring it back up again. And finally, with the biodiversity, again, really important, again, for that infiltration of providing different sizes of pores and also just different biota, which will help to prevent or soil organic matter, which increases the water holding capacity. So you bring all of these different soil health principles together to try and simulate as much as possible that forest soil, where you have all of that infiltration, you have almost no runoff, and the soil really stays in place, even though it doesn't look as covered as this hay soil is.